So the value of knowing how little you know. So this was actually the title of my PhD thesis, and I'll show you how to do this analysis in Analytica. But first, a little bit of history of how I got here. Well, going very back to ancient history, this picture is James Ussher, the Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland. And among other things, he's famous for this book that he wrote, published around 1650, in which he said the world was created on 22nd of October 4004 DC at 6 p.m. in the evening. So he did not suffer from a lack of confidence or in the accuracy of his pronouncements. And this book contains a detailed analysis of how he came up with that calculation. So this gentleman, Sir Neville Mott, was professor of physics actually when I was studying physics at Cambridge in the Cavendish laboratory, and I had the pleasure of learning a little bit about quantum physics from him, most of which I have forgotten. But he also said a number is meaningless without a statement of its uncertainty. And although I might not have paid a whole lot of attention to it as an undergraduate, later on this, in a certain way, set me on my career. And I only went back relatively recently to discover he was the originator of this. Kind of a contrast with Archbishop Ussher. And so when is it worth considering uncertainty? And so if you building a quantitative model in Analytica or a spreadsheet or whatever you like to use, most people ignore uncertainty. They put in a single value assumption for their rate of return on their investment, and so on. But obviously there are uncertainties in every assumption. So the question is, and it takes effort and time if you want to express them and analyze them completely. Perhaps you have some data that you can estimate distributions from. Maybe you'll do an expert elicitation. You'll talk to some experts on the topic and try to get them to express their best judgment on the quantity you care about using a probability elicitation process to provide that effort, perhaps as a 10th, 50th, 90th percentile that distribution. And then you build a probabilistic model, a little bit easier to do in Analytica than some other tools, and you do the Monte Carlo simulation. And lastly, you try to explain the results of your probabilistic analysis to your clients. So, we like to think it takes a whole lot less effort to do that if you're using Analytica than it might if you're doing a spreadsheet, perhaps with a Monte Carlo add-in or some other tool, but still, it's more effort. So the question is it worth it? Or when is it worth it? Well, here's some reasons. First of all, thinking about the range of possible futures instead of just a best estimate gives you a deeper understanding of the problem. And you can imagine and explore a wider range of possible futures. And ultimately, I would argue it leads to better decisions. But how often are these the case? And how much better are the decisions? So back when I was doing my PhD at Carnegie Mellon a few decades ago, decided it would be kind of interesting to see if there's a way to analyze this. And so I ended up writing a PhD thesis entitled The Value of Knowing How Little You Know, and introduced this concept of the expected value of including uncertainty, which I'm going to try to talk about and illustrate today. And for those of you that want to learn more about this than I'll be talking about today, it's actually in this book that I published with Granger Morgan on uncertainty, There's a chapter that explains it, assuming you don't want to go back and look at my PhD thesis. Then I went up to found Lumina and helped create this Analytica tool that I think most of you on this that are attending here are familiar with. And so, but going back to the beginning, when I was doing my PhD, my advisor was Granger Morgan at Carnegie Mellon. Here's a photograph of us back in 1978. Here's another photograph we took 40 years later, viewing the results instead of on only some of you from some older generations will recognize what this is in the left-hand photograph, a telephone with a modem talking to a teletype. Now we're 40 years later looking at our Analytica results on an iPhone. Well, 78, it wasn't Analytica, it was a thing called Demos. And Granger, I was kind of looking around to find a PhD advisor that would be relevant to my interest in treating uncertainty, and finally found Granger. We flew around the country doing a series of expert elicitations on air pollution. And as a result, we had to do quite a lot of flying together. And Granger's approach to catching an catching a flight is be there, at least 45 minutes or an hour ahead of time, and don't stress. My approach, at least in those days, was the optimal decision was to arrive at the gate just as they were closing the gate and to be the last person onto the plane. And as you can imagine, this created a certain tension between me and Granger. And, he wasn't too enthusiastic about all the stress of wondering if I was going to make it on this trip. So I decided, well, maybe this would be an interesting topic for an application for this question of when to deal with uncertainty. Now, we're all pretty familiar with this question of what time should I leave to catch a plane? So, here's a typical influence diagram. Let's say I have a plane at 8 o'clock in the morning from San Jose. So what time do I want to leave my house? Well, I like snoozing in bed for as long as I can. I don't want to get up too early if I don't need to. But I hate to miss the plane. So my decision, naturally, I drew up an influence diagram for the problem. My decision is what time to leave home. There's various uncertainties. How long will it take me to drive from my home to the airport? How long will it take to get from the parking gate, from parking rather to the gate, with uncertain time that it'll take to get through security? And how long do I need to be at the gate? Nowadays, they won't let you on just before the plane leaves, as it turns out. But of course, when I was doing this was long before, when I was doing my PhD, this was long before we had security lines. It was possible to run through the airport from parking to the gate without much hindrance, but I'm glad to say we don't need to do that now. And then I'm trying to minimize my expected time wasted, so some of the time wasted might be if I'm hanging around at the gate because I got there too early. But of course, if I miss the plane, there'll be a whole lot more time wasted. And we try to do an analysis of that. And what I'm going to do now is go into a version of this model in Analytica. This is actually running in the Analytica Cloud platform, our new release of ACP. And So we have our influence diagram here. Here's my distribution on how long it'll take to drive to the airport. You know, I could go in there, change the parameters. Right now, it's a median time is about 45 minutes. So with a geometric standard deviation, well, it's a variable in this model. You know, time to get from parking to the gate, time that I need to be at the gate. In this case, I decided to put in a triangular distribution with a 10, most likely 15, and high end of 20 minutes. So I add those together to see, well, what is the distribution on the total time it'll take to get to the gate? And you can see there's a fair amount of uncertainty. The mode is around 80 minutes. So if I ignore uncertainty, I might decide to allow, 81 minutes. I'll leave my house 81 minutes before the scheduled departure. Now, we all know that's not really a great way to make a decision because of the significant uncertainty of how long it'll take to get to the airport. In my case, I have to drive down Route 17, which is notorious for traffic, or at least it was pre-COVID. It's a little bit better these days. And of course, it's uncertain, how long it'll take me to get through security, and even uncertain how long they'll want me to be at the gate. So we could do our analysis here. I'm going to, instead of my decision, I'm going to set up as look at a variety of different options from 60 minutes up to 150 minutes. And then we can look at how much time be lost. Actually, let me first of all look at this view. So deterministically, assuming that the plane will leave exactly 80 minutes, or it'll take me exactly 80 minutes to get from my home to the gate, then if and this horizontally, we have the time to leave, the amount of time I allow from when I leave to when the plane is scheduled to depart. So, and vertically, we have a loss in minutes. And so if I allow exactly 80 minutes and catch the plane, there's zero loss and zero time waiting around at the gate. That's the optimal decision. If I leave home earlier, leave a longer time, then there's a certain amount of time lost waiting around at the gate. So the longer I leave, I have a certain amount of loss. But of course, if I leave less than 80 minutes, I'll miss the plane. And in this case, we put in a probability distribution of the loss if I miss the plane, with a mean of around 400 minutes. I'll have to get the next plane and it'll be awkward, Granger will be upset, so on. But a fair amount of uncertainty about that. So again, let's look at the loss here. So now, in addition to the loss ignoring uncertainty, we can look at the expected loss. And because of the uncertainty, it kind of smooths out this jagged cliff curve, the red one. The green curve, the expected loss, taking the average over a Monte Carlo sample, is softer. So now, deterministically, my optimal decision is 80 minutes. But if I'm trying to minimize the expected loss, then the optimal decision looks like it's around 105, 110 minutes right here. That's the lowest point on the green curve. That's sort of my Bayes decision to minimize my expected loss. So what is the value of me considering uncertainty? You know, the best, it says here, the best time considering uncertainty is 105 minutes. The best time if I ignore uncertainty is 80 minutes. So what's the difference between those two? So the expected value of including uncertainty in my analysis is 25 minutes. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint to explain how I calculate that. And just want to show you, for those that are interested in ACP, here we're going into the modules. Here's a little bit more of the model where, but I think I will, at this point. So here's the loss function ignoring uncertainty that we just looked at. And time wasted on the vertical axis, time to leave home, my decision on the horizontal axis. And there's my optimal decision ignoring uncertainty is 80 minutes. And my expected loss with the optimal decision there at the lowest point on that, about, well, 107 minutes. So if I ignore uncertainty and leave 80 minutes, I'm going to miss the plane about half the time. And the expected loss is where the 80 minutes crosses the curve, which is just about here, is about 225 minutes loss. Or here's the expected loss considering uncertainty. You know, that's the average time I've, quote, wasted at the flight plus some amount of time if because occasionally I'll miss the plane even if I allow that long, which is that expected. And then the difference in expected loss between the decision if I ignore uncertainty here or consider uncertainty here is the EVIU. In this case, it's around 200 minutes. So the EVIU is the increase in expected value due to choosing a Bayes decision that maximizes expected value or minimizes expected loss equivalent when I'm considering all the uncertainties explicitly, compared to the expected value of the deterministic decision that maximizes value, ignoring uncertainty. So, I mean, there's a slightly tricky thing here that I'm looking as a Bayesian, considering the uncertainty and figuring out the expected value, this deterministic decision. By the way, I'm going to stop here for a moment and stop sharing just to see if there's any questions or comments at this point. Feel free either to speak or you know, send in chat text if you have any questions. Okay, no questions. Okay, well, feel free to, okay, Greg is saying it makes sense to him so far. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Thanks, Greg.
Max, this is Joe Matola.
Yes, hi, Joe.
Yeah, so are you going to talk about how to apply this thought process to other domains? I mean, this is, you know, a nifty backgrounder, but you know, sometimes the mechanics of which of these parameters should I introduce uncertainty to, and there's a thought process that you go through, and I'd be interested in a little more on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. Let me go back to the Analytica model briefly, and I'll say a few things about that. So there's kind of different kinds of decisions. I mean, one is, are we going to treat uncertainty at all? And the EVIU is one kind of guide to that, but there's some qualitative insights that I'll talk about coming out of it. Perhaps the EVIU, or value considering uncertainty, tends to be large when you have a value function or a loss function that has a cliff like this. And, if you think about it, that sort of becomes intuitive. We all know that when you're trying to catch a plane, there's this kind of cliff function, but there's a lot of larger and more important decisions that have that kind of characteristic. So for example, suppose you're an engineer building a bridge and you're trying to, let's say it's a suspension bridge, and you're trying to figure out, well, how thick should the cables be? The thicker they are, the more expensive they are to manufacture, and the more expensive they are to install. But if you make them thinner, at some point, there's a risk that the bridge will collapse. Now, to my knowledge, most engineers do not do this kind of explicit probabilistic analysis. They use kind of rules of thumb, well, we're going to make it, twice as strong as the calculations suggest the maximum load is going to be. Or, but when you're designing an aircraft, perhaps the cost of extra weight is greater. You might have a slightly narrower one when you're designing a truck. Another example of a highly asymmetric loss function is when you're planning electric power utility, let's say, and you want to make sure that you have enough generation to meet the peak demand. But of course, you don't exactly know what the peak demand is going to be. You know that having that extra generation is going to cost you. But if you don't have enough generation, like we had the year before last in California, and you start having rolling blackouts, the utility gets a lot of grief, as well as, of course, losing money, but that's kind of probably secondary to the amount of grief they get for not having enough power. So there's a variety of decision problems that have this characteristic. It doesn't have to be as sharp as this, even if it's kind of an asymmetric curve. So perhaps you're going to be doing your probabilistic analysis anyway. You're convinced that it's the right thing to do, and you're using Analytica, so it's not that hard to do. But the question is a bit different, which is, how much effort should I put into estimating each of my uncertain quantities? So, you might do a tornado chart to, okay, only one for you, or we might do an importance analysis. Looks like we have a little issue here, but asking how important to the thing we care about, in this case, our objective, minimizing time loss, is the uncertainty in each of these inputs. And we start out with a, pretty rough estimate, and then we see, well, the time to drive to the airport seems to be the dominating uncertainty. So we will, if we're going to put some more effort into estimating the uncertainty, we should focus on that. Interestingly, the relative importance of these things varies. Here, we'll go back to the desktop Analytica version. So the uncertainty about whether I missed the plane has no importance in this case, but that's because I'm deciding to allow at least 130 minutes. If I'm leave, let's say, only 90 minutes, then that starts to become more important. So the point is that...
Yeah, but somehow it seemed like the fact that things go non-linear if you miss the plane, and now instead of waiting around a few minutes, you're waiting around for hours,
yes,
is a critical part of the whole thing.
absolutely.
So that's the sort of quandary that I face in modeling cybersecurity and that sort of thing, is that got this uncertainty. So the process of going through parameters, it seems as though, even though their tornado chart would say missing the plane is no big deal, it turns out that it's really the biggest of the deals, it appears, in terms of the falling off the cliff aspect.
Yes, I mean, what I'm showing here is that it kind of depends a little bit on your decision structure, but certainly in cybersecurity applications, usually, I mean, we've been doing this analysis for some examples in cybersecurity. You're right, there's often the question, is it the uncertainty about what the total loss will be if there's a breach, or is it uncertainty about the chance that there will be a breach? And it depends on your problem. I guess the ones we've been looking at, although there's a lot of uncertainty about both of those things, it often seems to be that the uncertainty about the frequency of a breach has more effect than the loss, the magnitude of the loss. I don't know. Have you seen things like that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway,
I would also mention that
Lonnie,
when we talk about importance, that's one type of sensitivity, and it's really a metric that says how much does the uncertainty of the cost of missing the plane affect the uncertainty in our final result, the time lost, which is a little different than saying, like, how much is 1 unit of driving time worth, or something like that. So, that loss is definitely the big factor in determining, our net cost at the end. But it's the importance is really showing us how the uncertainty affects the uncertainty.
Oh, thanks, because that basically says, even though the covariance is small, which is the uncertainty aspect of it, since the number is so big, it has a significant influence on the decision process. So, thank you. Good point.
So, so one way to think about the expected value of including uncertainty is looking at the ratio to the expected value of perfect information. So those of you that have a little bit of background in decision analysis will probably be familiar with the concept of the expected value of perfect information. So essentially, EVPI is how valuable would it be to me in terms of being able to make a better decision if I knew the actual value of all the uncertain quantities, if I knew exactly how long it was going to take me to get to drive and get to the airport and to get to the gate. And whereas the expected value of including uncertainty is, how much better is it if I'm explicit about the uncertainty versus ignoring it? And it turns out for some problems, and notably in this kind of problem with a cliff loss function, the EVIU can be significantly larger than the expected value of perfect information. And then other problems, it's not so large. But I should, coming back to kind of reality, when is it worth considering uncertainty? Here's a second take on the question. And there's on this question I asked at the beginning. So, as I've talked about in some detail, when your value or loss function is asymmetric, as cliff is sort of perhaps the most extreme case. Or if you're just risk averse, then where your utility, whatever it is you care about, is nonlinear in the value or the uncertain quantities. Or if you're in the situation where you have to decide, is it worth paying for more information to reduce your uncertainty, doing a survey, talking to more experts, building a more detailed model? Well, one way to answer that question, or perhaps the best way according to a decision analyst, is looking at the value of information. And you can only estimate the value of information if you have an explicit probabilistic model and you treat the uncertainty in the quantity, and you also have a decision model that tells you how learning the value will improve your decision. And therefore get additional expected value. As we just talked about, by being explicit about the uncertainty, it's useful in guiding sensitivity analysis to figure out, well, not just should you buy more information, but should you build a more elaborate model, which is in a way another way to get more information. A last point, well, maybe not quite the last, the penultimate point. I think it often happens that if you examine uncertainty, if you, instead of just assume a single value, but you think about the range of possibilities, the kind of thought process and the information gathering and exploration, in many cases, I've seen that it actually changes what your, quote, best or most likely or deterministic number would be. Because as you start to think about the various extreme possibilities, you may realize that actually some of them are more likely than you were thinking beforehand. And so again, this is kind of one of the values of being explicit about the uncertainty. And finally, one might argue that as a quantitative analyst, yes, you can do a deterministic model and kind of tell your client, this is what they should do. But, realistically, that many of the quantities are uncertain. And, one might argue that the analyst has an ethical responsibility to be frank and clear about the uncertainties and the limits of their knowledge and its implication for the decision. Here's a picture of Socrates, and as he famously said, if I'm thought wise, it's only because that I know nothing. And at least according to Plato, this is what he said. And of course, this didn't really go down well with the other philosophers and people who thought that they were wise in the Athens of his day. And this is one of the various things that he said or did that annoyed his fellow Athenians. And famously, they condemned him to death. And here, this painting is of him swallowing his cup of hemlock with all his disciples and around him in despair. But he seems relatively happy about this fate. So I guess the point is that in some cases, being explicit about one's uncertainty doesn't necessarily make you popular. Well, I'd argue maybe it doesn't make you popular at the first time, but over time, people are going to may respect you more for your frankness about the quality or the accuracy of your analysis. So any more comments or questions?
Hey, Max, this is Dan Violet.
Yes, hi, Dan.
It seems to me that this is directly applicable to looking at uncertainty in R&D investments. I mean, you know, everything you talked about here, the value of information. And as I mentioned to you a while back, that I had this problem with ComEd where they had to do R&D on a number of electric generation alternatives. And they were trying to figure out how to invest their monies in looking at a couple of different demand side technologies. And, you know, this, well, it's a slightly different version of this question, but I think it's almost exactly the same. I mean, if you ignore the uncertainty around what your findings might be in each of those investments, I think you kind of gravitate to just this type of analysis. Would you agree with that or not?
Absolutely, because I mean, essentially, R&D is, well, certainly the R part and maybe the D part is about buying information. I mean, you're conducting research, not just to improve the technology, but to find out whether it works, whether it's going to be valuable to enterprise, especially for, you know, utility company is, you know, trying out a variety of different new technologies to see how effective they are. And of course, there's uncertainty. And I mean, there's also the question of when you're doing R&D, you typically are developing a portfolio of R&D projects. You know, there's the common thoughts about, well, having a portfolio gives you, there's some value in diversification. But really to evaluate that properly, you need to understand the uncertainty about each project and the correlation structure between the projects. Really, you can only do that with explicit treatment of the uncertainties.
Yeah, I
hi,
have
Matt.
kind of a follow-on to that. This is Greg speaking from
Yes.
Westinghouse.
Okay.
As far as using this sort of decision analysis in the context of informing R&D investments, I was just wondering if you could share any lessons learned, or I guess ways that you've seen people be successful in taking sort of very nebulous problem statements and trying to model those numerically. So it seems like to model something like this in Analytica, we need to be able to quantitatively capture the uncertainties with some sort of distribution, you know, via elicitation or other means. And oftentimes we do have decisions to be made that have non-negligible epistemic uncertainties, I suppose, regarding plausible ways in which we can make R&D investments. But it's very difficult to know why we'd invest here versus there, because we can't like put hard numbers to it. So I was just wondering if there are maybe any tactics or things along those lines that you've used to try to assist in those sorts of decision problems.
Sure. Well, I might say a few things, and then maybe I'll ask Dan, since he has a lot of experience in this area. So, I mean, there are some industries, notably pharmaceuticals, and, you know, more recently, electric power, where and oil and gas, where, but, you know, perhaps especially pharma, where some of the large companies do, you know, explicit probabilistic portfolio analysis of their R&D, because, you know, if you're developing a new drug that might cost $1 billion eventually to bring to market if it's successful, but there's, you know, relatively small chance of success early in the project, it really behooves them to do explicit portfolio analysis. I know, Greg, did you have ideas about particular industries that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've I work at Westinghouse in the nuclear industry, like nuclear energy. But I suppose maybe more generally, we're not strictly tied to nuclear. So I suppose it could apply to maybe energy in a more general sense. But, say we're looking at different aspects of power generation. We have like in our case, we have the nuclear side, and we also have the turbine side. We could make certain investments in the turbine side of the plant or certain investments in the nuclear side of the plants, and they all have kind of a potential value proposition that could be quantified. But just sometimes the ways that we can formulate the problems are not necessarily conducive to quantifying uncertainties with numbers. So it just, to try to take, voiced concerns coming from people who are in the energy industry in various sectors, and to try to take those kind of spoken concerns and to try to translate those or transpose them into something numerical that we can then quantify in Analytica. That's sort of the general topic that I have in mind here.
Yeah. Dan, do you have any things you'd like to say about this? By the way, for those of you who don't know, Dan Violet joined Luminar a couple of years ago. He was previously managing director at energy consulting at Navigant and has a huge amount of experience in helping utility companies address R&D issues.
Yeah, Greg, yeah, this is Dan Violet. The issues, the questions you raise are exactly the kinds of challenges that I've run into in trying to work with utilities and look at R&D and investment strategies. Often you run into kind of the comment that they're too uncertain about how uncertain they are to dimension uncertainty. And of course, that's kind of not a great argument. But one of the uncertainties I've had to deal with the equipment was the length of life. I mean, how well will that equipment work as situated, and how long it'll work. So we have this kind of length of life uncertainty. And what I found was if I tried to push people to give me too much discrimination in the probability distribution, I would fail. They just felt like they couldn't do it. And so what we did is we tried to establish upper and lower bounds. We said, well, what's the earliest you think this might need replacing? And then what's the latest it might need replacing? How long might it last? So I tried to get brackets on the upper and lower bounds. And then we kind of discussed what those bounds were. And we concluded that, yeah, it might be a little bit lower. It might be a little bit longer. And so we kind of looked at those with kind of 90% confidence intervals, or maybe even 80% confidence intervals. And then what we used for the density of the probability distribution between those upper and lower bounds was a fairly simple distribution, often a triangular distribution or even a flat distribution. And then we'd run our models and we'd look at how that uncertainty affected the decision. And what we found was in a couple of projects was just establishing the upper and lower bounds tended to make a big difference in the outcomes. Meaning that if you had something that was very uncertain, had a low bound and a high bound that were far apart, that kind of dominated the solution set compared to the density of the probability distribution between the upper and lower bound. And then what we would do is we do some sensitivity analysis for the density of the distribution. We try to get some information from them, like could they say it was skewed? What were the odds if they had to place a bet on the true number falling into the upper half of the distribution? We tried lots of things, and eventually, I had to present these results to somewhat skeptical stakeholders at the utility, and even in some cases at the regulatory commissions. And we were able to do it. We were able to develop findings and get findings that were actually used in decision making. In fact, we even won an award for a project we did for Bonneville about a decade ago from the regulatory community. So it can be done, but it's really tough. And if you push people to give more detailed information than they can give, they'll just reject the entire analysis. So I've come up with this set of simplifying assumptions that I hope work, but I'd certainly be interested in your opinion about kind of what we tried.
Yeah, I like your suggestion of that application. And I'm working from a coffee shop now, by the way, so my computer speakers might be picking up some background noise. But yeah, in any case, yeah, the prognostication of remaining life on equipment is certainly a big issue for us. So yeah, I like that suggestion, is, you know, maybe trying out something like eliciting those upper and lower bounds for remaining life on a certain piece of equipment, and kind of from that proactively trying to construct some sort of uncertainty or probabilistic model, and then using that as kind of a communication tool to kind of iterate with the stakeholders. It sounds like the approach that you've taken involved a lot of kind of back and forth between the modeler of the uncertainty and the stakeholder. So maybe kind of having those open lines of communication is kind of a necessary ingredient to having these sorts of models be successful.
Absolutely. I'm just showing on the screen this is a library model that's available with Analytica that is for kind of looking at R&D project portfolio analysis. You know, it's a kind of relatively simple illustrative model. And we have a set of projects here. Excuse the fanciful names. And then for each project, we have a set of uncertain inputs, you know, R&D cost, probability of the R&D will be successful, release date, product lifetime, production cost. And we can actually, you know, we use this simple influence diagram to take these different quantities and estimate the NPV revenue for each of those projects, for each of those products, you know, assuming it actually gets released. And so this is, you know, obviously a simplified version, but based on a tool that we built for an actual client. And
yeah, this type of modeling is like, yeah, ideal for some of what I'm faced with of recent. I'm in our R&D department basically, and we have dozens of things that we could potentially be investing in. And the challenge is, you know, where is that investment most warranted? And so it looks like what you have structured here could be quite useful in approaching problems like that.
Yeah, well, I think this model is included with Analytica, but we can send you a somewhat more recent version that I'm showing you here if you're interested. Yeah. Obviously, I'm running it on the web in ACP here, but you can equally well run it on your desktop.
Hey, Greg, this is Dan again. We did this project for Bonneville on equipment replacement at substations. And what we had to do first was we had to go out and talk to the distribution system engineers to find out how they currently made decisions, meaning they had rule of thumb lifetimes for pieces of equipment, and they'd replace them after 5 years, they'd replace them on failure. And then we had to go back to the manufacturer of the equipment and say, here's our people that are making decisions right now in the field. If you could present this kind of information to them, you could change how they make these decisions, and they would make better decisions, and your equipment would have an advantage compared to other equipment being offered to this group of people that were making these decisions on substations. So it was a very interesting project. And of course, we found out that the way people made decisions in the field were just all rule of thumb types of decisions, and they were very unsophisticated. And helping them make more sophisticated decisions was kind of the benefit of the work that we did for Bonneville.
Thanks, Dan. One of the things I'd like to point out in this model, so this part of it is all about, you know, computing the NPV revenue from each of the R&D projects. But, you know, what we found in reality, there's a bunch of other things that organizations care about than, you know, simply revenue. I mean, in this case, the other attributes in addition to net revenue are, you know, strategy fit. How well does this project support the general direction we're trying to take the company? Staff development, you know, if we do this project, are we going to be able to attract and retain and train our staff that in this area, and public goodwill or public relations. How well is this project going to go over with it, and how we how people look at our company. So in this model, you can select either just the net present value as your selection criterion, or you can use a multi-attribute score that includes these other more qualitative attributes, but still quantified as part of the overall score. And then you can look at essentially here are the projects ordered in terms of the ratio of expected net revenue to cumulative costs. So what that means is if we have a budget, let's say of 5 million, we'd take the projects below that. And we can set up a manual portfolio where we just kind of decide, okay, my boss tells me direct messaging has to be on there, so we're going to do that anyway. And then we also have an automated portfolio where Analytica is making the optimization. And either way, so here we've got, we can see that the manual one and the automated one overlap quite a bit, but the automated one, you can kind of tell, has a slightly higher distribution and looks a bit easier to see in the cumulative form. You can see that the automated portfolio dominates the manually generated one. Anyway, happy to share this with anyone if they want to play with it. So any other questions or comments? We have a couple of minutes, but wanted to leave at the end of the hour, but
So, Mac, this is Joe again.
yes.
My question is model integration. I have a project coming up, and over the years, for decades, I've generated lots and lots of models. And in order to do this upcoming project, I'm going to need to integrate 4 or 5 out of 30 or so candidates. If I were, when I'm doing this in Python or Ruby, I have these dependency checkers and things like that that'll go through my code and help me do refactorization and stuff like that. I really love the way that Analytica lets me load models into models and so forth. But my concern, so my question is, I haven't been able to put my finger on, I haven't tried very hard, but I haven't put my finger on model integration tools, techniques, a tutorial or whatever that would help with this. And part of it is that the parameter space gets too big. But before that, really the mapping dependencies among models without doing full model integration, or even when you're trying to do that incrementally. So my question generally has to do with, are there pointers available, or do others have thoughts on how to do model integration? These all have to do with wireless and all, and it's a 5G model. So, so 5G is complex. Go ahead, thank you.
So you have a number of Analytica models, or some in Analytica and some in other platforms?
Yeah, well, the ones that I'm mostly interested in are in Analytica.
Okay, and they have some kind of variables and assumptions in common and some different ones?
Yep.
So, well, let's see. I mean, the short answer is there's a little bit of information on the wiki about that, but maybe not everything that you want. And what I'm thinking is maybe it would be useful, we could have a separate conversation. We could kind of go into some details and make some suggestions, because I think it's, it's not something I can give a quick answer to, but we do that certainly at Lumina, and some of our other customers do quite a lot of integrating models, and so there are some techniques that can be useful for that. But maybe we.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I'll look for a follow-up on that
Yeah,
then.
why don't we do that offline? But so that's a
Thank you very much.
Any other final comments or questions? Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate you joining us today. And this is the first in what is going to be a series of monthly seminars, webinars on analytical applications, how to use it. And I'd also say, we at Lumina will be doing some of those, but if any of you, Joe or Greg or anybody else that's on here, or Jorge, or Laurie for that matter, have example applications that they would be interested in sharing with a larger audience, we would certainly welcome that. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Very much enjoy the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. It was
Thank you.
master exposition. And you're a philosopher too.
Okay. And for those that haven't seen it, Jorge Arbelu is a professor in Peru, gave a wonderful talk on Analytica and AI applications last week in Spanish. So we're hoping to get an English version in due course. But any Spanish speakers be welcome to, we'll have it linked on our site shortly. Thanks very much, everyone.
I believe
Cheers.
Jorge is also planning on doing some additional webinars in Spanish on
Okay.
various topics. So we
Excellent.
may have those as part of this series too, but it will for the Spanish speakers.
Very good.
Yes,
Cheers.
indeed. I am trying to follow the path of learning.
Okay. Cheers.